He hadn't cried since the day they buried his mother, but standing in the summer heat, watching a woman clutch a torn suitcase with shaking hands, while a crowd of people walked past her like she was nothing, Caleb Thornton felt something crack open in his chest that he thought had turned to stone years ago. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He only knew one thing. Nobody should ever stand alone like that. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Montana Territory, summer 1886. The sun came down hard on the Thornton Ranch like it had a personal grievance. The kind of heat that turned the mountain air into something thick and mean. The kind that made horses restless and men short-tempered. But Caleb Thornton had worked through worse. He always had. He was up before the sun that morning, the way he'd been up before the sun every single morning for the past 11 years. His boots hit the floor of the empty cabin before the sky even thought about turning pink. He didn't need an alarm, didn't need a wife calling him to breakfast, didn't need anyone, or so he told himself. He was 37 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that made door frames feel like an inconvenience. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once asked someone else to do what he could do. Himself scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the palms, steady as iron, even when the rest of him wasn't. His face had been weathered by 11 Montana winters and 11 Montana summers. And if there was any softness left in it, he hid it the way a man hides something he's ashamed of. They called him the mountain wolf around Harlan Creek. Not to his face, of course. Nobody said much of anything to Caleb's face except the bare minimum. Yes, sir. No, sir. Mornin', Caleb. The kind of words people used when they wanted to get through a conversation without getting too close to something they didn't quite understand. He was used to it. He'd grown up large and quiet, in a town that didn't know what to do with either of those things. His father had been the same way, a man of few words and enormous presence, the kind of man who communicated mostly through action and whose silence said more than most people's speeches. Caleb had inherited both the size and the silence, and somewhere along the way, the people of Harlan Creek had decided that a man who didn't talk much and took up too much space must have something to hide. He didn't. He just didn't see much point in explaining himself to people who'd already made up their minds. That morning he fed the horses before he fed himself. Checked the fence line on the east pasture that one of his ranch hands, a young kid named Denny, had flagged the night before. He walked the property the way he always did, unhurried, deliberate eyes taking in everything. The Thornton land ran deep into the mountains, hundreds of acres of grass and pine and creek water, and Caleb knew every inch of it the way a man knows his own heartbeat. He'd built it. Every fence post, every water trough, every structure on this land had either been built by his father before him or rebuilt by Caleb's own hands after the fire. He didn't like thinking about the fire. He especially didn't like thinking about who he'd lost in it. By the time he came back to the main barn, his 3 ranch hands were already starting the morning work. Denny, 19, and eager in a way that was sometimes annoying, and sometimes the only thing that reminded Caleb that youth hadn't completely died out of the world. Old Pete, who was 60-something, and claimed not to know his own exact age, which Caleb suspected was either genuinely true or a strategy to avoid birthday conversations. And Marcus, a black man from Tennessee who'd come north looking for fair wages and found them on the Thornton Ranch when nowhere else in the territory would give them to him. Caleb paid fair wages. He didn't make a speech about it, he just did it. Fence on the east side needs 2 new posts, Caleb said, stepping into the barn. Denny, you and Marcus get on that this morning. Pete, I need you to check the water levels on the upper creek. It's been running low. Yes, sir, they said in the overlapping way of men who'd worked together long enough to become a kind of machinery. Caleb moved to the far stall where a mare named Juniper stood with her head low, her breathing slower than it should have been. He'd noticed it the night before, and it had followed him into what passed for sleep. He put his hand against her neck, feeling for heat, counting the rhythm of her breath. Still not right, he murmured. She'll come around, Pete said from the doorway. She's tougher than she looks. So is everybody, Caleb said, but he didn't look up from the horse. He stayed with Juniper for an hour, checked her hooves, her eyes gave her fresh water, and stood with her in the quiet of the barn, while the morning moved on without him. His hands were gentle in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd only ever seen him from a distance. People expected a man his size to handle things roughly, to move through the world with the blunt force of his own physicality. But Caleb had always believed that strength meant you could choose not to use it, that real power was in the restraint. He'd learned that from watching his father with horses. He'd tried to learn it in everything else too. He rode into Harlan Creek just before noon. He didn't go to town often. Once a week for supplies, maybe twice if something was needed urgently. He'd learned years ago that the less time he spent among people, the less opportunity there was for the particular kind of hurt that came from watching folks step aside when he walked down the boardwalk or go quiet in a way that wasn't respectful silence but something colder. He tied his horse, a big black stallion named Judge, outside Carver's general store, and went in for what he needed. Flour, salt, some wire for the fence repairs, and a tin of the medicinal salve he used for the horses. He'd been getting the same supplies for so long that old man Carver had most of it ready before Caleb even got to the counter. "Hot one today," Carver said, pushing the bundle across the counter. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Heard there's a woman come into town this morning," Carver said with the careful tone of a man sharing information he wasn't sure would be welcome. "Widow woman, young, came in on the early stage." Caleb put his money on the counter. "That's so. People been talking." Carver lowered his voice in the way men did when they wanted to gossip without calling it gossip. "Nobody knows her. No family here, no money. Sheriff was asking around to see if anyone knew her people." Caleb picked up his bundle. "Appreciate the supplies, Mr. Carver." He didn't think much more about it as he came back out into the summer heat. He had fence posts to sink, and a mare to worry over, and about 4 hours of work left before the light got bad. He didn't have time to think about a widow woman he didn't know. That's what he told himself. He was untying Judge when he heard it. Not a scream, not a shout, just a voice, a woman's voice coming from the direction of the sheriff's office, low and tight, the voice of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. "I'm not asking for charity," she was saying. "I am asking for the chance to work. There is a difference." Then, another voice. Sheriff Dale Holt's voice, lazy and self-satisfied the way it always was. "Ma'am, I understand your situation. But this town can't be taking in every stray that steps off the stage. I am not a stray." The words came out sharp as a slap. Caleb stood still. "I beg your pardon," Holt said. "I said I am not a stray." Her voice didn't waver this time. "I am a woman who has worked every day of her adult life. I am a woman who can cook and clean and manage household accounts and tend livestock. I am asking for work, Sheriff, not a handout. Work. And if this town has none to offer me, then tell me plainly, and I will find somewhere that does." Silence. Caleb found himself walking toward the sheriff's office without quite deciding to. He came around the corner of the building and stopped. She was standing in the dusty street in front of the sheriff's office, and she was the word that came to him unbidden, was steady. Her back was straight. Her chin was up. She was holding a battered carpetbag in one hand, and she was looking Sheriff Holt directly in the eye, with an expression that had no pleading in it at all, only a kind of exhausted, iron-spined dignity. She was young, or younger than him anyway. Dark hair pinned up under a worn hat, a blue dress that had seen better days. She wasn't beautiful the way women in dime novels were beautiful. She was real in a way that hit harder than beauty. There were shadows under her eyes and a tension around her jaw that spoke of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will for a very long time. Holt saw Caleb first. His eyes flicked over and something shifted in his expression, the faint wariness that Caleb's presence tended to produce in people. "Thornton," Holt said. "Can I help you?" "Just passing," Caleb said. The woman turned. She looked up at him, and he was used to that, the way people had to look up. And for a moment, he waited for the thing that usually happened. The step back. the slight tightening around the eyes that meant fear dressed up as something else. She didn't step back. She looked at him with those tired, clear eyes, and she said, "Are you the man who owns the big ranch north of town?" He blinked. "I am." "Do you have any work available?" Behind her, Holt made a small sound of surprise. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Holt, who had the decency to seem at least slightly uncomfortable. Then he looked back at her. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Any kind." No hesitation. "Cooking, cleaning, record-keeping. I have experience with livestock. I can manage a household. I learn quickly." She paused. "I am not asking to stay for free. I will work for a fair wage and a place to sleep. That is all I'm asking." "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Harper." "Where are you from, Miss Harper?" "Missouri originally. I've been in Colorado for the past 2 years." Something moved across her face briefly, grief or the shadow of it, and then was gone. "My husband passed. I had to leave." Caleb turned the information over slowly, the way he turned most things. There was no calculation in it, no strategy. He was simply a man who thought before he spoke, always had been, and he was thinking now about the stiffness in Holt's posture and the crowd of townspeople he could see gathering at a polite distance, watching with the barely concealed interest of people who had found their afternoon's entertainment. He thought about the empty cabin near the North Creek that he'd been meaning to find a use for. He thought about how Juniper needed more attention than he had hours in the day to give her. He thought about the ranch house that hadn't had a proper cooked meal in it since Pete's wife had moved back to Missouri 3 years ago. But mostly, if he was being truthful with himself, he thought about the way she'd said, "I am not a stray," and the way nobody in this town had thought to argue with Holt on her behalf until she had argued for herself. "I've got a cabin on the north edge of my property," he said. "It's small, but it's sound. You'd have your own space." He paused. "I need someone to help manage the household side of the ranch. Cooking some records, helping with the animals when needed. Pay is fair, and it's given on time." Elizabeth stared at him. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why would you offer that to someone you don't know?" The question sat there between them in the summer heat. Holt was watching. The townspeople were watching. And Caleb stood in the middle of all of it and said what was true. Because somebody should. She said yes. Not immediately. She was careful he'd learn that about her. She thought things through, in the same deliberate way he did, but she said yes before the sun went down. She asked to see the cabin first. He showed her. She walked through it with a practical eye, checking the stove, the window latches, the roof for signs of leak. She asked about the water source, the outhouse, the distance to the main house. She asked about the other ranch hands, and he told her about Denny and Pete and Marcus, and she nodded slowly. "Are any of them the kind of man I'd need to worry about?" she asked. He met her gaze. "No." "Your word on that." "My word." She thought for another moment. Then she set her carpetbag down on the cabin floor with the kind of finality that meant she'd made her decision. "All right," she said. "I'll need some things from town. Make a list. I'll see to it." She looked up at him then, and it was the second time that day she'd looked at him without stepping back, and he didn't quite know what to do with that. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton," she said. "Caleb," he said. She nodded once. "Caleb." He expected it to be awkward. It wasn't. Or it was at first the way most new arrangements were. The first morning she arrived at the ranch house before anyone else was up and started a fire in the kitchen stove. And when Caleb came down, he found her moving through the kitchen with the focused efficiency of someone who had been running a household for years. She'd found where everything was kept with a minimum of searching, and she'd started a pot of oats and coffee without asking his permission or his help. She handed him a cup when he appeared in the doorway. He took it, drank it, said nothing. She didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter which he appreciated more than he could have said. They found a rhythm faster than he'd expected. She ran the house like she'd been running houses all her life, which she told him when he asked the third or fourth evening when they found themselves both still in the kitchen after supper was finished. She'd kept house since she was 14, first for her family, then for herself and her husband. What was he like? Caleb asked. He wasn't sure why he asked. He wasn't usually a man who invited other people's personal history. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. He was a good man, she said finally. Gentle. He was a school teacher. He wasn't built for the kind of hard work this country demands, and he knew it. A pause. He was honest about his limitations. I respected that in him. How'd he die? Fever. Her voice was simple, direct. It came in March. He was gone by April. She looked down at her cup. His family never cared much for me, said I wasn't good enough. Missouri farming family, and I was just the preacher's daughter with no land and no money. She smiled, and it was a sad, tired smile that held no self-pity. When he died, they came and took everything that could be claimed as his family's. I had nothing left but my clothes. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "That ain't right." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked up at him. "But it's done. I'm not interested in crying over it. I'm interested in what comes next." He studied her in the lamplight. "How old are you?" 27. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Does that matter to something?" "No," he said. "Just trying to understand how you're as steady as you are." She seemed surprised by that, like she hadn't expected him to notice, or hadn't expected that if he noticed he'd say so. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but something warmer than what had been there before. "I learned steadiness the same way everybody does," she said, "by having no choice but to be." It was Denny who started talking. Caleb should have expected it. Denny was 19 and not yet old enough to know that some things were better left unsaid, and he had a good heart underneath his loose mouth, which made it hard to be properly annoyed with him. "You hear people in town talking about Miss Harper?" Denny said one morning while they were working the horses. "No," Caleb said. "I did." Denny hesitated. "They're saying things. About her being here alone without family. Martha Pryor at the boarding house told the banker's wife that a woman with no name and no people has no business at a single man's ranch." Caleb kept his hand steady on the lead rope. "Martha Pryor can mind her own business." "Yes, sir. Only they're also saying things about you, about your motivations like." Denny looked deeply uncomfortable. "I just thought you should know." "I know," Caleb said. "It ain't right." "No, it isn't." He looked at the young man. "But what's right and what people say are two different mountains, Denny. Always have been." Denny chewed on that for a moment. "Miss Harper know they're saying things." Caleb paused. He didn't know. He hadn't thought to wonder. He'd been so accustomed to ignoring what the town said about him that it hadn't fully occurred to him that she was the one who'd be carrying the heavier weight of it. He found her that afternoon on the porch of her cabin, sitting in the late daylight, with a ledger open in her lap. She was working through the ranch accounts he'd asked her to help organize the last 3 years of records, which Pete had been keeping in a method that was technically complete, but practically indecipherable, and she had a small frown of concentration on her face that he'd already learned meant she was somewhere deep in a problem, and didn't appreciate interruption. He knocked on the porch post anyway. She looked up. "Are people in town giving you trouble?" he asked. A beat of silence. "People in town always give women without family trouble," she said. "It's not particular to this situation." "That's not an answer." She held his gaze. "Martha Pryor said something to me at the Mercantile yesterday, about my reputation and the impropriety of my position." She paused. "I told her that my position was employed and respectable, and that if she had concerns about impropriety, she might direct them at the men in this town who'd watched me stand in the street asking for honest work and done nothing." Caleb stared at her. "She did not take that well," Elizabeth added. "I imagine not. Are you worried about what they're saying?" she asked. There was no challenge in it exactly. It was a genuine question. Caleb leaned against the post. "I stopped worrying about what Harlan Creek says about me around about 1879, he said. "They've been calling me the Mountain Wolf since I was 22. I've never asked anyone's permission for anything on my own land." Something in her face softened slightly. "Then I reckon we're in the same position." "I reckon we are." She went back to the ledger. He stood there a moment longer than he'd meant to. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "the men who work my land are decent men, and anyone who comes to this ranch with bad intentions about you will answer to me." She looked up again. "I believe you," she said. It was such a simple thing to say. Such a direct, uncomplicated thing. "I believe you." Not thank you with the performative gratitude he sometimes got from people who were afraid of him. Not a nervous smile and a quick change of subject, just plain, level-eyed belief. He walked back to the main barn with something strange and cautious settling in his chest. The night it rained was the night Caleb Thornton began to understand that he was in trouble. Not the bad kind of trouble. Not the kind he knew how to fight. The other kind. It had been 3 weeks since Elizabeth Harper had come to the Thornton Ranch, and in that time, the place had changed in ways that were hard to quantify and impossible to ignore. There was food in the evening that was actual food, not the functional sustenance that Pete put together when it was his turn to cook. There were records that made sense. There was someone who checked on the horses with him at night without being asked, because she'd noticed the pattern of his worry and matched it with her own attention. There was someone. He kept coming back to that. That night the rain came down hard, the way mountain summer rains did, sudden and heavy flooding down out of the peaks with no warning. He was in the barn when it started checking on Juniper, who'd been improving slowly and steadily under their combined attention. He heard the cabin door open and looked out through the barn doorway and saw Elizabeth crossing the yard in the rain, a lantern in one hand. She came into the barn soaked to the shoulders. "I checked the north fence line," she said, dripping. "The creek's running high but not over yet." He looked at her. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she said. "But I knew you were worried about it." She pushed wet hair back from her face and moved to Juniper's stall, checking the mare with practiced hands. "She sounds better tonight." "She is," he said. They stood together in the quiet of the barn while the rain hammered the roof, and it was the most natural thing in the world, her on one side of the mare, him on the other, the lamplight making everything warm and close. "You know what I noticed today?" she said. "What?" "There were 2 bags of flour left at the Hennessy place this morning. The Hennessy's have got 5 kids and Tom's arm is still bad from that fall last spring." She looked at him across the horse's back. "They told me someone had been leaving supplies. Every 2 weeks or so. Left before dawn, never saw who." He said nothing. She studied him. "Pete told me it's been going on for 3 years." Still nothing. "Caleb." "It ain't a big thing," he said. "It is," she said quietly. "It is a very big thing." She held his gaze. "Why haven't you told anyone?" "Because then it wouldn't be about helping them," he said. "It'd be about me wanting people to know I'm helping." She was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know," she said, "that in the 3 weeks I've been here, not a single person in this town has said anything good about you to me? Not one." She paused. "And in those same 3 weeks, I have watched you spend an hour with a sick horse every single morning. I've watched you pay 3 men fair wages without being asked to. I've watched you not charge the Delaney family when their fence crossed onto your land." She looked at him steadily. "I know who you are, Caleb Thornton, and I want you to know that I know." The rain fell outside. Juniper breathed slow and even between them. And Caleb Thornton, who had spent 11 years believing that no woman would ever look at him and see anything worth keeping, stood very still and said nothing, and felt the crack in his chest from that first morning open a little wider. He didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. Caleb had been a poor sleeper for years. His mind was the kind that didn't know how to stop working just because the sun had gone down. But that night, it wasn't the ranch accounts, or the fence line, or Juniper's breathing that kept him staring at the ceiling of his cabin. It was 11 words. "I know who you are, Caleb Thornton, and I want you to know that I know." He turned them over and over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the edge of something sharp. He kept waiting to find the catch in it. The angle. The particular kind of pity that sometimes dressed itself up as understanding. He'd had that before, women in town who were kind to him in the careful way you're kind to a large dog you're not sure about. Warm enough at a distance, never quite comfortable up close. Elizabeth Harper wasn't kind to him at a distance. She looked at him straight on. She talked to him like he was a man whose words were worth hearing. She pushed back when she disagreed with him, which had happened twice already, once about the way he was pricing the late summer hay, and once about whether Denny was ready to take on more responsibility with the horses, and both times she'd done it without flinching, without the nervous sideways glance that said, "I hope this doesn't make you angry." She just said what she thought. He wasn't sure he'd ever had that. Not from a woman, not from anyone who wasn't already on his payroll and therefore contractually obligated to at least pretend to respect him. He was still thinking about it when he heard the horses go restless just before dawn. He was on his feet and out the door in under a minute, crossing the dark yard to the barn, with his hand already moving toward the rifle he kept beside the door. It was a reflex, not a panic. 11 years of mountain ranching taught a man that restless horses in the dark meant something had come in from the tree line. Could be a mountain lion. Could be a bear nosing around the feed. Could be nothing more than a coyote passing close enough to catch the wind wrong. He came into the barn and stopped. Elizabeth was already there. She was standing in the middle of the barn aisle in her boots and a heavy coat thrown over what was clearly her night clothes, a lit lantern in one hand and a pitchfork handle in the other. Not the pitchfork itself, just the handle which she'd apparently grabbed from the wall on her way in. She was looking toward the back of the barn, where the horses were still shifting uneasily in their stalls. She didn't look scared. She looked ready. "Bear," she said without turning around. "I can smell it." He stood there for a second. "You hear it before I did." "I'm a light sleeper." She finally turned and looked at him, taking in the rifle. "Is that loaded?" "Always." She nodded, accepting that the way she accepted most information, quickly, practically filing it away. "It's around the back, I think. It came in from the creek side." They dealt with the bear together. It was an old one, big, slow, interested in the grain storage more than in trouble. Caleb fired one shot into the ground 10 feet from it, and it lumbered back into the dark without much argument. Elizabeth held the lantern high the whole time, steady-handed, not flinching at the shot. When it was done, she let out a long breath that was almost a laugh. "That's the second one this summer," she said. "Third," he corrected. "One came in early June before you got here." She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of a real smile. "You're keeping count." "On this ranch," he said, "you keep count of everything." She looked at him for just a moment longer than the conversation required. Then, she hung the lantern back on its hook and started checking the horses one by one, running her hands down their necks, speaking to them in a low, steady voice that he could hear but not quite make out the words of. He watched her work. She moved through the barn like she'd been doing it all her life. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Like she knew exactly where she belonged in a space and how to take up exactly the right amount of it. He turned away before she could catch him looking. "Go back to sleep," he said. "Probably should," she agreed without moving. They both stayed until the horses settled. The trouble with Harlan Creek arrived on a Tuesday the way most trouble arrived in small towns, gradually and then all at once. Caleb had been into town that morning for a bank meeting. He owned enough land that Gerald Marsh, the bank president, liked to schedule what he called courtesy meetings twice a year, which were less courteous than they were strategic. Marsh's strategy being to remind Caleb at regular intervals that the bank held paper on 2 of his eastern pastures and that this fact should make Caleb feel something. Caleb did not feel something. He'd been paying on those notes for 9 years and had never once been late. And he found Marsh's implications distasteful in the way he found most things Marsh did distasteful, which was most things. He was coming out of the bank when he heard the voices. 2 women on the boardwalk across the street. He recognized Martha Pryor's voice before he saw her. She had the kind of carrying voice that seemed to be engineered for maximum spread, like a broadcast system nature had developed specifically for small-town gossip. "It isn't decent," Martha was saying. "A widow woman living on a single man's ranch with no chaperone and no family. What does that say about her character?" Her companion made a sympathetic sound. "And the way she walks around town like she has every right to be here," Martha went on. "I heard she practically threatened Gerald Marsh when he mentioned she might want to find more appropriate lodging. Said she had a contract of employment and that he could speak to his lawyers if he had concerns." Caleb had gone very still on the boardwalk. He knew Elizabeth hadn't mentioned any encounter with Marsh to him, which meant she'd dealt with it on her own, the way she dealt with everything quietly, directly, without asking him to fight her battles. The image of Gerald Marsh with his soft hands and his practiced condescension saying something to Elizabeth about appropriate lodging, it put a particular kind of cold in Caleb's chest. He crossed the street. Martha Pryor saw him coming and had the sense to look slightly alarmed. Her companion took a small step back. "Mrs. Pryor," Caleb said. "Mr. Thornton," she said with the tightly pleasant smile of a woman who was moderately afraid of him but committed to not showing it. "I couldn't help overhearing what you were saying." He stopped at a polite distance. He kept his voice level. "About Miss Harper." Martha lifted her chin. "I was having a private conversation." "You were having it at full volume on a public boardwalk," he said, "which makes it less private than you might think." He held her gaze steadily. "Miss Harper is an employee of the Thornton Ranch. She has a signed contract of employment and a private residence on my property. Her character is not a subject that needs discussing on any street in this town. Mr. Thornton, I understand your position, but people will talk." "People always talk," he said. "The question is whether what they're saying is true, and what they're saying about Elizabeth Harper isn't." He paused. "I'd appreciate it if you kept that in mind." He walked back to his horse without another word. His hands were steady, his face was calm. But something was moving underneath all of that, something that had been building slowly for weeks and had just found its first outlet in defense of a woman who hadn't asked him to defend her and probably wouldn't thank him for it. He was right about that last part. When he told her that evening what had happened, she put down the dish she was drying and turned to face him with an expression that was caught somewhere between gratitude and exasperation. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I can handle Martha Pryor. I know that too." He leaned against the kitchen doorframe. "I wanted to." She studied him for a moment. Why? He thought about lying. He thought about a safer, cleaner answer that kept everything at a manageable distance. He'd been doing that for 11 years, keeping things at a manageable distance, and it had kept him very safe and very alone, and he was getting tired of both. "Because the things they're saying aren't right," he said. "And because you've been handling things on your own for a long time, and I didn't want you to have to handle this one too." The silence that followed was different from the silences they usually let sit between them. This one had more weight to it. "Gerald Marsh came to see me last week," she said. He straightened. "What did he say?" "He said that my presence at the ranch was drawing unwanted attention to the bank's investment interest in your land." She said it evenly, like she was reading from a ledger. "He implied that a woman in my situation should think carefully about the kind of reputation she was building." "What did you say to him?" Something flickered in her eyes. "I told him that his investment interest in the ranch was a matter between him and you, and that my employment was a matter between me and you, and that if he conflated the two, I would be delighted to explain the difference to whatever lawyers he wished to involve." Caleb stared at her. "He left," she added. "I imagine he did." "I wasn't going to tell you," she said. "I didn't want you to feel like you needed to." She stopped. Chose different words. "I don't want to be a problem for you, Caleb. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. The last thing I want is to bring trouble to your door." He pushed off the door frame and came fully into the kitchen. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she'd have to look up at him, and he said, "Elizabeth, look at me." She looked. "You are not a problem," he said. You have not been a problem for one single day. And Gerald Marsh has been a problem for me since 1881, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't take responsibility for his bad character. A beat. Can you do that? A long moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more real than a smile. I can try, she said. It was Marcus who first said it out loud. They were mending fence on the west boundary. Caleb, Marcus, and Denny, a long, hot, ugly job that required focused hands and offered the mind too much freedom to wander. Marcus was the kind of man who paid attention to everything and said very little, which meant that when he did say something, it was worth hearing. They were a good hour into the work when Marcus said without looking up from the wire he was pulling, "You smile more." Caleb didn't answer. Since Miss Harper came, Marcus continued. You smile more. You talk more. Last Tuesday you asked Denny about his mother. He paused. You never asked anybody about their mother before. I asked Pete about his back last April, Caleb said. That's a medical question, Marcus said. Not the same thing. Denny, who had clearly been waiting for someone braver than himself to open this door, jumped through it with the enthusiasm of someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. He's right, boss. You even laughed last Thursday. I heard it from the other barn. It scared me a little because I didn't recognize the sound at first. Get back to work, Caleb said. Neither of them got back to work, not immediately. She's good people, Marcus said quietly. She's real good people, and she looks at you like... He stopped himself. Like what? Caleb said. Marcus glanced at him sideways. Like you're somebody worth looking at. Caleb put his hammer down. He looked out across the mountain property, his land, his fence line, the earth he'd spent 11 years working into something from almost nothing, and he felt the ache of it more clearly than he had in years. Not the ache of loneliness exactly, something more precise than that. The specific ache of a man who could see a thing he wanted and couldn't yet bring himself to reach for it. She's an employee, he said. Yes, sir, said Marcus. She's got a life to rebuild. She's got her own plans. She didn't come here to... He stopped. No, sir. Marcus agreed. A pause. She looked at me the same way when she found out you've been leaving food at the Hennessy place, Denny said helpfully. I saw her face. She looked like somebody had just told her something she'd already sort of suspected, but was still surprised to have confirmed. Caleb picked his hammer back up and went back to the fence. Marcus looked at Denny. Denny looked at Marcus. They both went back to work. The twist came from the east the way bad news usually came to Harlan Creek. It was a Thursday morning 5 weeks after Elizabeth had arrived, and Caleb was in the yard when he saw the rider. He knew something was wrong before he could have said why there was a quality to the way a man rode when he was carrying urgent news. A particular urgency in the horse's pace that had nothing to do with hurry and everything to do with anxiety transmitted through the reins. The rider was Tom Hennessy with his bad arm and his worried eyes, and he pulled up outside the yard fence and called out before he'd fully stopped. Caleb, there's a man in town, a lawyer they say, looking for Miss Harper. Caleb set down what he was holding. What kind of lawyer? The kind Gerald Marsh is talking to behind closed doors, Tom said. They were in the bank this morning when I went in for the Henderson payment. I heard the man named Whitmore from Denver. Richard Whitmore. Tom's jaw was tight. He's asking questions. About Miss Harper's husband. About his property in Colorado. A pause. About her. Caleb was already moving toward the house before Tom finished speaking. He found Elizabeth in the kitchen, and he watched her face as he told her the name. He'd seen Elizabeth Harper afraid exactly once the night she'd first arrived and stood in the street in front of Holt's office with her carpet bag and her chin up and her eyes not quite steady. She'd mastered it so quickly that he'd almost doubted he'd seen it. He'd learned since then that she was not a woman who showed fear easily or willingly. She showed it now. It was brief, a second, no more. Her eyes went wide, and then her jaw set, and her hands, which had been holding a kitchen towel, went very still. Richard Whitmore, she said. You know him. He was my husband's family's lawyer." Her voice was level, careful. After James died, Whitmore was the one who delivered the papers claiming the family property. He was the one who told me I had no legal standing to contest the estate. She set the kitchen towel down slowly. He told me if I left Colorado quietly, there would be no further action. And if you didn't? Her eyes met his. He implied that a woman alone with no family and no money would not enjoy the experience of a legal dispute against the Whitmore family. Caleb stood very still. What does he want now? I don't know. Her voice finally fractured just at the edge. She controlled it, immediately pulled it back. I don't know, Caleb. I did everything they asked. I left. I came north. I started over. She looked down at her hands. I thought it was done. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down deliberately, putting himself at her level rather than standing over her, which he'd have to think about later as a thing he'd done without thinking. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. All of it. She looked at him for a moment. Measuring, he realized. Not measuring whether to trust him, he thought with a quiet shock that she already did. She was measuring whether telling him would make it real in a way that keeping it to herself had protected her from. Then she sat down across from him, and she told him. James Harper had been a schoolteacher from a family with middling land in Colorado, not wealthy, but property holding, which in 1884 meant something. He and Elizabeth had married young, and for 3 years they had built a modest real life together. When he died, the property should have gone to Elizabeth. They had a marriage contract. She had documentation. But Richard Whitmore had represented the Harper family for 30 years. He knew every judge in 2 counties. And when Elizabeth had tried to contest the estate, she'd found herself staring down a legal apparatus that was perfectly designed to exhaust and overwhelm a woman, alone with no resources and no advocates. There was a second document, she said. Whitmore produced it at the final hearing. A codicil to James's will supposedly signed 3 months before he died. She looked at her hands on the table. James was already sick 3 months before he died. He could barely hold a pen. I told the judge that. He said I had no supporting evidence. A pause. The codicil left everything to James's brother. You think it was forged? Caleb said. I know it was forged, she said quietly. I watched my husband's hands fail for 6 months before he died. I know what his signature looked like at the end. That document wasn't his hand. She looked up. But I couldn't prove it. And Whitmore knew I couldn't prove it. So I left. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Why is he here now? He said. If they already won. That was the question that sat between them like a stone. Elizabeth pressed her lips together. When I left Colorado, I had a small box of James's personal documents, letters, records he kept himself. I thought at the time I just wanted something of his, something personal. She paused. I didn't look through all of it carefully until later, until I was already in Montana. She looked at him steadily. There are letters in that box, Caleb. Letters between James and his brother from the last year of his life. Letters that suggest James specifically told his brother that he was not changing his will, that everything was going to me. The air in the kitchen changed. Those letters would contradict the codicil, Caleb said slowly. They would more than contradict it. Her voice was very quiet now. They would prove it was fraudulent. And if the codicil was fraudulent, then Whitmore didn't just mismanage an estate. She held his gaze. He participated in theft, possibly fraud, definitely perjury. A beat. He's not here about old business, Caleb. He's here because he found out I have those letters. Someone told him, and he wants them back. The kitchen was completely silent. Caleb sat across from her and felt everything in him go very, very still. The particular stillness that preceded not anger exactly, but something colder and more purposeful than anger. The stillness of a man who has just understood exactly what he is dealing with and is already thinking 3 steps ahead. Where are the letters? He said. She met his eyes. Somewhere safe, He nodded once. He didn't push. He filed away the trust that was in that answer she hadn't told him where they were, which meant she was still protecting herself, still maintaining the ability to walk away if she needed to. He understood that. He respected it. He would have done the same. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She blinked. Like the question had surprised her. "What do I—" She stopped. Started again. "People don't usually ask me what I want to do." "I'm asking." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, he could hear Denny's voice in the yard, the sound of horses moving, the ordinary sounds of the ranch going on around this extraordinary stillness in the kitchen. "I want to fight," she said finally. "I have always wanted to fight. I've never had anywhere to stand while I did it." He looked at her across the table. "You've got somewhere to stand now," he said. He meant the ranch. He meant the employment contract. He meant the legal and physical resources of the Thornton land, and name which in Harlan Creek and the surrounding territory amounted to something real. But the way she looked at him when he said it suggested she might have heard something more than that. He wasn't sure he was ready to think about that yet. Richard Whitmore came to the ranch the following morning. Caleb had expected a man in an expensive coat, and he wasn't wrong. Whitmore was 50-something broad through the middle, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more calculated. He came with a younger man who had the look of a hired assistant, and he came smiling, which Caleb distrusted more than he would have distrusted a scowl. He met them at the yard gate. "Mr. Thornton," Whitmore said, extending his hand. "Richard Whitmore of Whitmore and Associates in Denver. I appreciate you receiving me." Caleb looked at the hand for a half-second before shaking it. "Mr. Whitmore, what can I do for you?" "I've come on a matter regarding one of your employees." Whitmore's smile stayed exactly where it was. "A Mrs. Elizabeth Harper. I understand she's been in your employ for approximately 5 weeks. Miss Harper works on this ranch, yes. I wonder if I might speak with her. I wonder if I might ask why." The smile tightened, very slightly, the kind of adjustment a man made when he was accustomed to his requests being received as authority and was recalibrating. "There are some unresolved legal matters from her late husband's estate," Whitmore said smoothly. "A clerical matter, really. Shouldn't take long." "Then you can put your clerical matter in writing," Caleb said, "and have it delivered to her. She'll respond through whatever legal means she sees fit." Whitmore's smile didn't move. His eyes did. "Mr. Thornton, I understand you're trying to protect your employee, and I think that's admirable. But this is a legal matter, and I'm afraid—" "You're afraid of nothing," Caleb said quietly. "You're a man who came here believing that this is a simple situation because she's a woman alone, and I'm just a rancher, and nobody out here is going to know the difference between a legitimate legal matter and a fishing expedition." He held the lawyer's gaze without any particular heat in it, just steadiness, the steadiness of a man who is not impressed and is not afraid and is not going to move. "I know the difference, Mr. Whitmore. Write her a letter." A long pause. "She has documents," Whitmore said, and the smoothness had left his voice, just slightly, just enough to confirm everything Elizabeth had told him. "Documents that belong to the Harper estate." "Any documents in Miss Harper's possession belong to Miss Harper," Caleb said. "If you believe otherwise, talk to your lawyers. I'm sure they can explain how property law works." Whitmore stared at him. Then he looked past Caleb toward the house. Caleb shifted just slightly, just enough to move directly between Whitmore's line of sight and the house. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore," he said. The lawyer left. The assistant scrambled after him. Caleb stood at the gate until the sound of their horses had faded down the road, and then he turned back toward the house where Elizabeth was standing on the porch. She'd heard everything. He could see it in her face, not just gratitude, though that was there. Something more complicated. The look of a woman who has spent years being told that she is on her own and who is struggling visibly and honestly with the evidence that this is no longer entirely true. He walked back up to the porch. She said, "You didn't have to do that." You keep saying that, he said. It keeps being true. Does it? He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. You told me last night you've been wanting to fight. You've been wanting to fight for 2 years. You've just been fighting alone. He looked up at her. You don't have to fight alone anymore, Elizabeth. Not while you're on my land. Her throat moved. It's going to get worse before it gets better, she said. Whitmore doesn't give up easily. He'll go to Marsh. He'll put pressure through the bank. He'll try to make it costly for you to stand between him and what he wants. Let him, Caleb said. Caleb. Let him, he said again. I've been dealing with men like Whitmore my whole life. Men who think that size and money are the same thing. Men who think that if they push hard enough, everyone moves. He held her gaze. I don't move. She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. Tell me about the fire, she said. He went very still. She must have seen the change in him because her voice softened. Pete mentioned it once. He didn't say much. Just that there was a fire and that things were different after. She paused. You don't have to. My wife, he said. The word fell into the air between them and stayed there. Elizabeth didn't speak. Her name was Rose, he said. His voice was even. He'd had 11 years to make it even. We married young. She was the first person who ever looked at me the way you... He stopped, chose a different path. The fire was an accident, a lamp in the barn. She went in to get the horses out. A pause. She got 3 of them out. The silence stretched. There was nothing left, he said. After, not of the barn, not of I rebuilt everything. Took 2 years. But some things you rebuild, and they're not the same. He looked at his hands. I stopped believing that anyone else would ever want to stay. I figured it was easier that way. Elizabeth came down the porch steps. She stopped 1 step above him so they were level eye to eye, and she said, You've been carrying that alone for 11 years. Yes, and you've been feeding the Hennessy family, and paying fair wages, and treating a sick horse like she matters. Yes, while believing nobody would ever want to stay. He met her eyes. Yes, he said very quietly. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, not grasping, not dramatic, just her hand there steady and warm the way she was steady and warm, the way she did everything directly and without apology. I'm still here, she said. He didn't answer, but somewhere deep in the chest that had been cracked open since the first morning, he'd seen her standing in the street with her chin up and her eyes clear. Something shifted. Something old and heavy and long settled moved just slightly, just enough towards something that felt for the first time in 11 years like the possibility of home. She didn't move her hand right away. That was the thing Caleb kept coming back to later, when the night was quiet, and his mind was doing what it always did, picking through the day's events, like a man checking fence line for weak spots. She'd put her hand on his arm and said, I'm still here, and then she'd just stayed there, not pulling back, not making it into something awkward with words, just letting the moment be what it was. He wasn't sure anyone had ever done that for him before. He slept better that night than he had in weeks, which worried him more than the insomnia had. Morning came the way it always did, indifferent to whatever a man had decided the night before. The horses needed feeding. The fence on the north pasture still needed checking after the heavy rain 2 days back. Old Pete's knees were bad, which meant Caleb would be doing Pete's share of the heavy work, without mentioning that he was doing it because Pete had his pride, and Caleb understood the specific misery of having your limitations noticed. The Hennessy supply run was due at the end of the week. The books needed reconciling. The ranch didn't care that Caleb Thornton had told a woman about his dead wife for the first time in 11 years. The ranch just kept being the ranch. He was grateful for that mostly. Elizabeth was in the kitchen when he came in for coffee, the same as every morning, now a routine that had established itself without either of them commenting on it. She handed him a cup. He took it. She went back to whatever she was reading this morning. It was a letter, and he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders before she noticed him noticing and straightened them deliberately. Whitmore, he asked. His office in Denver. She set the letter on the table between them. He's claiming James had a second property in Colorado that was improperly omitted from the estate proceedings. He says he needs to examine all personal documentation in my possession to ensure the omission is corrected. She paused. It's very carefully written. Nothing in it is technically a threat. Caleb picked up the letter and read it. It was the work of a man who had been writing legal correspondence for 30 years and knew exactly how to say, "Give me what I want, or I will make your life very difficult," in language that a judge would read as entirely reasonable. He knows about the letters, Caleb said. He knew before he came here. He just needed to see whether I'd tell him I had them. She looked at him. By coming here in person and leaving without them, he knows I do. Do you trust your copies? She hesitated for just a second. I made 2 copies before I left Colorado. One is with me. One I sent to a woman I trust in Kansas City. She saw his expression. My mother's cousin. She's the only family I have left who she'd keep them safe. She'd know what to do with them if something happened. He absorbed that. Filed away the part where she'd said if something happened with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who had thought carefully about her own vulnerability and made provisions for it. I want to write to someone, he said. Who? A man I know in Helena. Arthur Graves. He's the federal land commissioner, but before that he practiced law for 20 years, and he has no patience for men like Whitmore. He watched her face. He owes me a favor, a real one. I want to write to him and explain the situation. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. You do that, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I'd do that, he confirmed. She looked at the letter on the table, then back at him. Caleb, I need you to understand something. When I told you I wanted to fight last night, I meant that. But I also meant that it's my fight. I'm not asking you to carry it. I know you're not asking. Then why? Because I want to, he said simply. Same reason I told Whitmore to leave. Same reason I said what I said to Martha Pryor. He held her gaze. Elizabeth, you said you've never had anywhere to stand while you fight. I'm telling you that you do now. That's not me taking over your fight. That's me giving you ground to stand on. The look on her face was something he couldn't quite name. Not quite gratitude. Something that sat below gratitude, deeper and more complicated. The look of a woman who was trying to figure out what to do with something she'd wanted for a very long time and had stopped believing she'd ever get. She picked up her coffee cup. Write your letter, she said. The shift in Harlan Creek happened so gradually that Caleb almost missed the moment it tipped. It started with small things. The way Gerald Marsh's teller looked at Elizabeth when she came in to deposit the ranch accounts, a look that had shifted from the neutral blankness of a man ignoring a difficult situation to something more pointed, more deliberate. The way 2 ranchers' wives who had been civil to Elizabeth for weeks suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere in the mercantile when she was shopping. The way Sheriff Holt stopped her one afternoon in the street to ask, in his laziest voice, whether she'd given any more thought to finding more permanent lodging in town. I have permanent lodging, she told him, at the Thornton Ranch. Well now, Holt said, that may have been fine for the summer, but people are starting to talk, and a woman in your position might want to think about, my position, Elizabeth said, is employed sober and current on my contractual obligations. Is there something specific you'd like to discuss, Sheriff? Because I have accounts to deliver before noon. She'd told Caleb about it that evening, not because she was frightened, but because she had noticed the pattern and wanted him to know she'd noticed it. She laid it out the way she laid everything out systematically, without drama, with the clear-eyed analysis of a woman who understood that information was its own kind of protection. It's coordinated, she said. It's not just gossip. Someone is encouraging it. Marsh, Caleb said. Or Whitmore through Marsh. She looked at him across the kitchen table. He can't come after the documents directly, not without establishing a legal basis that he hasn't got. So he's doing the next best thing. He's trying to make your position in this town uncomfortable enough that you'll want me gone. Caleb looked at her. Does he know me at all? He said. Something flickered in her eyes, almost amusement. I don't think he does. Then he's going to be disappointed. What Caleb did next was not a grand gesture. It was the opposite of a grand gesture. He simply went about his business in Harlan Creek the way he always did, except that now when he went to town, Elizabeth came with him. Not because she needed an escort, because he asked her if she'd like to, and she said yes, and they walked the boardwalk of Harlan Creek together in the full Montana summer heat, and anyone who wanted to stare could stare. He introduced her when introductions were called for as Miss Harper. And he did it with the easy certainty of a man who sees no reason to apologize for anything. He disagreed with Old Man Carver about the price of wire, and Elizabeth caught his eye over the counter and nearly smiled. He ran into Tom Hennessy, and they talked for 10 minutes about the North Pasture water levels, while Elizabeth and Tom's oldest daughter discussed a book they'd both apparently read. It was ordinary. That was the whole point. The power of Whitmore's strategy was in making Elizabeth into a problem, something irregular, something that needed to be explained and justified. The answer to that wasn't confrontation. It was normalcy. It was treating her presence in his life as a fact that required no defense because it required no defense. He didn't think through all of that consciously. He just did it the way he did most things, by instinct, by the bone-deep understanding of a man who had spent his whole life being treated as something that needed to be managed, and who knew that the only answer to that was to simply keep existing steadily and without apology. Elizabeth understood what he was doing. He knew she understood because she matched him step for step without his having to explain it. That was the thing about her. He never had to explain himself. The first real crack came from a direction he hadn't expected. Denny came into the barn on a Thursday afternoon with a look on his face that Caleb had learned to read, as I know something you're not going to like, and I'm trying to decide whether to tell you. He'd seen that look often enough in the past 5 weeks that he'd developed a kind of shorthand for it. Say it, Caleb said, without looking up from the tack he was mending. Denny said it. A man had arrived in Harlan Creek 2 days prior. Not a lawyer this time. A private man, no official capacity. He'd been asking questions at the saloon at the boarding house at the livery stable. Questions about Elizabeth, about her time in Colorado, about her late husband, about the circumstances of her leaving. Who's asking these questions? Caleb said. Denny shifted his weight. Big fella. Didn't give his name to most people, but he told the liveryman he was from Denver. A pause. And he told the barman that he was looking for a widow woman who had taken something that didn't belong to her. The tack went still in Caleb's hands. He said that. Yes, sir. And the barman told him about Miss Harper being out here because... Denny stopped. Because people talk, sir, and I'm sorry I don't have better news than that. Caleb set the tack down. Where is this man now? As of this morning, he was still at the boarding house, Martha Pryor's place. A pause. She was real friendly with him from what I heard. Caleb stood up slowly. He went to find Elizabeth. She was in the cabin, and she went pale when he told her. Pale in the way of someone who has been half expecting news and found that expecting it had done nothing to cushion the arrival. She sat down on the edge of the chair near the door, and for a moment she just breathed in and out with the focused deliberateness of someone holding themselves together by main force. He brought someone, she said. Someone not attached to his office. Someone who can operate without... She stopped, started again. Caleb, if this man is here asking questions about me taking something that doesn't belong to me, Whitmore is preparing a legal framework to have me charged. The words landed like stones. On what basis? Caleb said. It doesn't matter what basis. Her voice was very controlled. A woman alone with no family and no resources facing a charge in a territory where Whitmore has connections. It doesn't have to be a good charge. It just has to cost enough to fight that I can't fight it. Caleb crouched in front of her chair so he was at her level. Listen to me, he said. She met his eyes. You are not alone, he said. You have not been alone since the day you came to this ranch. And before you tell me again that you're not asking me to carry this, I know. I know you're not asking. I am telling you as clearly as I know how that I will stand in front of every single one of these men for as long as it takes. Not because you need me to, because it is right, and because—" He stopped. He hadn't meant to leave it there. The sentence had had a different ending when it started, an ending that would have said something true, but would have also said more than he was certain he had the right to say yet. She was looking at him very carefully. "Because," she said. He stood up. "Because a good man does what's right." He said which was true, and which was also not the full answer, and from the way she watched him stand, he thought she knew that. "Your letter to Helena," she said after a moment. "Did you send it? 2 days ago?" "How long before we hear back?" "A week. Maybe less if Graves is in Helena and not out on survey." She nodded slowly, turning the timeline over in her mind. He watched her think, watched the particular quality of stillness that came over her when she was working through a problem, the way her eyes went slightly distant, and her hands went quiet in her lap. He'd seen it enough times to recognize it. It was one of the things he'd started cataloging about her without meaning to, the small specific things, the way she thought, the way she moved through a barn, the way she said his name. Caleb. 2 syllables. Direct. Like she meant it. "I need to write to my mother's cousin," she said. "I need to tell her to keep those copies safe, not just stored safe, hidden. I'll get you whatever you need." "I can manage paper and a pen on my own," she said. A small edge in it, not anger. More like someone reclaiming a handhold. "I know you can," he said. "I meant it differently." She looked at him. "I know," she said softer. "You." The man from Denver showed up at the ranch gate on a Saturday. His name, as it turned out, was Cord Jessup, and he was not a lawyer, and he was not precisely a lawman either. He was the kind of man whose exact occupation shifted depending on who was asking and what they were willing to pay, which meant he was the kind of man Caleb recognized immediately and did not like at all. He was big, not Caleb's kind of big, which was the big of a man who had grown into himself slowly and with a great deal of physical labor, but the deliberate big of someone who had cultivated their size as a professional tool. He had the eyes of a man who was accustomed to people stepping back when he looked at them. He rode up to the yard gate, and Caleb was already standing there. "Thornton," Jessup said. "That's right. I'm here to speak with Elizabeth Harper. Got a message for her from her late husband's family." "Leave it with me," Caleb said. "I'll see she gets it." "Message is meant to be delivered in person." "Then you're going to be waiting a long time," Caleb said. "Because nobody gets onto this property to speak with any employee of mine without my knowing the nature of their business first. That's how this ranch works." He held the man's gaze without shifting his weight. "What's the message?" Jessup studied him. Making calculations, Caleb could see it the way the man was reading the situation, adjusting his approach. "The Harper family is concerned about some personal documents that went missing after James Harper's passing. Letters. They'd like them returned. If Miss Harper has letters from her late husband, they belong to her. That's a matter of legal interpretation. Then get a lawyer to write her a legal letter," Caleb said. "Whitmore seems to have plenty of paper and time. He can manage one more." Something moved in Jessup's face. Not anger, closer to reassessment, like a man who had come expecting a simple problem and was finding a more complicated one. "Mr. Thornton," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. Dropped into something more level, more private. The voice of a man switching from the public performance to the real negotiation. "I think you understand what's at stake here better than you're letting on. And I think you're a smart enough man to know that protecting somebody else's secrets on your own land is a complicated business." A pause. "Especially when the bank holds paper on 2 of your pastures." There it was. Caleb felt the cold move through him. Not fear. Nothing like fear. Something cleaner. The specific clarity that came from understanding that the threat had finally been made explicit. "Get off my land," he said. "Mr. Thornton." "I won't say it twice." Jessup looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past him at the house the same way Whitmore had looked past him at the house, and Caleb moved the same way he'd moved then, just slightly, just enough. Jessup turned his horse around. He rode slow. Deliberate slowness. The kind that was its own kind of message. Caleb watched him all the way to the road. Then he turned back to the house, and Elizabeth was on the porch, and she had heard every word, and her face told him she had heard the part about the bank. "He's going to go to Marsh," she said. "He already has," Caleb said. That part wasn't improvised. "Caleb." She came down the porch steps. "If Marsh calls those notes, he won't." "You don't know." "He won't," Caleb said steadily. "Because calling in notes on the Thornton Ranch would cause a problem for every rancher in this territory who does business with that bank. Marsh is greedy, but he's not stupid. He knows if I go down loudly, and the noise will shake loose things he doesn't want shaken." He paused. "I've been doing business in this territory for 11 years. I know where Gerald Marsh's pressure points are. He knows I know." She stood on the bottom step and looked at him. "You're not afraid," she said. "Not of Marsh." "What are you afraid of?" The question came out quietly, like she hadn't entirely planned to ask it. He looked at her for a long moment. The summer light was heavy around them, thick and gold the way late afternoon got in Montana, and she was standing on the step, so they were almost at the same height, and her eyes were doing what they always did, looking at him like he was somebody worth looking at. "Failing you," he said. The words came out before he'd approved them. She went very still. "The way I failed Rose," he said. Because if he was going to say it, he was going to say it fully and honestly. "I built everything I could build. I worked every hour I had. And when it mattered most, I wasn't there." He held her gaze. "I don't want that to be the story again." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. "You told me last night," she said slowly, "that the fire was an accident." "It was. Then you didn't fail her. You lost her." Her voice was gentle, direct the way she was gentle, and direct about everything. "Those are different things, Caleb. A failure is a choice. A loss is something that happens to you." She paused. "You've been punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." He didn't answer. "And maybe," she said, "that's the same thing you think you're doing now. Protecting me so that this time it comes out different." She looked at him carefully. "I'm not Rose. I know that. I need you to know it the right way," she said. Not as a failing in me. Not as something that makes me harder to protect." She searched his face. "I'm a different woman in a different situation. And I do not need to be saved. I need a partner." A pause. "Do you understand the difference?" He thought about Rose, who had been sweet and gentle and entirely unsuited to the brutality of the land they'd tried to build a life on, and whom he had loved fiercely and tried to protect from everything, and failed to protect from the one thing that mattered. He thought about Elizabeth, who had walked into a room full of people who didn't want her and held her head up, who had faced Whitmore's letters and Holt's condescension and Martha Pryor's campaign of whispers, and dealt with every single one of them with a level-headed practicality that he had never once had to prompt. "Yes," he said. "I understand the difference." She nodded once, accepting that. Then, "Write to Graves again. Tell him it's more urgent than you thought." He almost smiled. "Already planning on it." "And Caleb." She looked at him steadily. "Whatever happens with Marsh, with Whitmore, with any of it, I need you to make me a promise. Name it. Don't make decisions for me," she said. "Don't manage this situation around me. Tell me everything. Let me be part of the strategy." A pause. "I can handle hard truths. I've been handling them for 2 years. What I cannot handle is being protected from information I have a right to have." He met her eyes. "You have my word." Something in her eased just slightly, just at the shoulders, like a tension she'd been holding released an inch. "Good," she said. She went back inside. He stood in the yard for a moment longer and thought about the word partner and what it meant in the mouth of a woman who chose her words the way Elizabeth Harper chose her words, carefully, deliberately, with complete understanding of what she was saying. He thought about it for considerably longer than was probably practical. The letter from Arthur Graves arrived on a Wednesday, which was 9 days after Caleb had sent his own, which meant Graves had turned it around fast, faster than the schedule required, which told Caleb that Graves had understood the urgency and prioritized accordingly. He read it twice in the yard before he went to find Elizabeth. Graves knew Whitmore. That was the first thing. Knew him professionally, knew his reputation, knew 3 other situations in Colorado and Wyoming where Whitmore had been adjacent to estate proceedings that had ended poorly for the women involved. He couldn't prove anything. Nobody had been able to prove anything, which was how Whitmore had kept operating, but Graves had been watching. The second thing was better. There was a federal circuit judge named Harris coming through Helena in 6 weeks. A man with a clean reputation and a particular interest in cases involving fraudulent estate proceedings, he'd made a name for himself 3 years ago, overturning a corrupt probate decision in Wyoming that everyone in legal circles had assumed was untouchable. Graves wanted to know if Elizabeth's documents were solid. If they were solid, he thought there might be a case worth making. Caleb brought the letter to Elizabeth in the cabin where she was working through the ranch accounts, and he watched her read it. He watched her face go through several things: surprise, careful hope, the particular caution of someone who had hoped before and been hurt by it, and then settle into something that was quieter and more serious than any of those things. She read it a second time. "He's real," she said. "Graves. He's a man you actually trust. He's a man who helped me get the eastern pastures out of a fraudulent land claim in 1882, Caleb said. When the original surveyor had taken money from the neighboring rancher to misplace the boundary markers. He paused. He did it because it was right, and he didn't ask for anything back except that I remember it. She looked at the letter again. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Whitmore will move before 6 weeks, she said. If he's going through Marsh and Marsh applies pressure to you through the notes, if he gets Jessup to keep asking around town if he... She stopped, looked up at him. We need to give him something to focus on, something that makes him think he's winning. Caleb tilted his head slightly. What kind of something? He thinks I have the original documents here on the ranch. She set the letter down and looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as her thinking out loud face, the one that meant ideas were moving fast and she was following them. What if I did? Elizabeth, not the real ones, the copies I have here. She held his gaze. If Whitmore thinks he's close to getting what he wants, he might slow down the pressure campaign. Buy us time to get to Graves before he escalates. A pause. Let him think he almost has it. Delay him. And if it doesn't work? Then we lose nothing. We weren't going to lose anyway, she said simply. But if it does? 6 weeks, he said slowly. 6 weeks? She agreed. He looked at her. Really looked at her at the particular way her mind worked, the practical courage of a woman who had been backed into corners before and had learned to think from inside them, who could look at a bad situation and find the angle nobody else had spotted. When did you figure this out? He said. Just now, she said. You figured out a legal strategy against a Denver lawyer in about 45 seconds. She looked mildly surprised. Is that fast? He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll talk to Pete about keeping an eye on the cabin at night. Jessup has the look of a man who doesn't stay hired if he isn't producing results. That's what I was thinking, too. Of course it was. She caught the edge of something in his voice and looked at him sideways. Was that a compliment? It was an observation, he said. But his voice had done something he hadn't authorized it to do, something warmer than an observation, and she heard it. She ducked her head back to the letter. I'll write to my cousin tonight. Update her on the timeline. And I'll write to Graves. Tell him we have solid documents and we need the 6 weeks. Yes, she paused. Caleb? When this is over, she stopped. Started again. I want you to know that whatever happens coming here, was the right decision, whatever else this becomes or doesn't become. She was looking at the letter, not at him. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost permanently. What's that? She looked up. The belief that good men exist, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, felt the weight of those words settle into him, felt them find the place that had been empty and cold for 11 years, and sit there warm and unexpected, like sunlight through a window he'd forgotten was there. He nodded once. He walked back out into the summer heat. And Caleb Thornton, who had stopped believing anyone would ever stay, began for the first time to let himself think about what it might mean if she did. The plan lasted 4 days. That was how long it took for Richard Whitmore to stop being patient. Caleb had expected more time. He'd read Whitmore as a man who worked methodically, who preferred legal architecture to direct action, who would take weeks to build pressure through Marsh and Jessup, rather than risk a move that could be witnessed and documented. He'd been wrong about the timeline, if not about the method, and it was the kind of wrong that woke him up at 2 a.m. with the particular cold clarity of a man whose instincts are sending up a signal he can't yet name. He was already pulling on his boots when he heard Pete's voice outside. Not loud. Pete never raised his voice. It was one of the things Caleb appreciated most about him. But there was a quality to it that Caleb recognized, a tightness that meant something had gone sideways. He came out of the cabin, and Pete was standing in the yard with a lantern and the look of a man who has bad news and knows that the man he's delivering it to will not react well. Someone's been in the north cabin, Pete said. The north cabin. Elizabeth's cabin. Caleb was already moving. He heard her before he saw her. Her voice coming through the open door, controlled and clipped in the way it got when she was managing anger. He came through the doorway and stopped. The cabin had been searched, not ransacked, nothing broken, nothing obviously destroyed, but every drawer was slightly open. The chest at the foot of the bed had been moved. The floorboards near the window had been disturbed, the dust pattern wrong. In a way only someone who'd been in this room enough times to memorize the pattern would notice. Elizabeth was standing in the middle of it with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her eyes taking inventory with the fast, flat efficiency of a woman calculating damage. They didn't find anything, she said before he could ask. The real copies aren't here. I moved them 3 days ago. He let out a breath. Where? She looked at him steadily. With Marcus. He stared at her. You told Marcus. I told Marcus enough. A pause. He's the least likely person Whitmore would ever think to ask, and he understands exactly what's at stake and why. She met his eyes. I hope that's all right. He thought about Marcus, who had come north from Tennessee looking for fair treatment, and found it on the Thornton Ranch, and had never once in 4 years given Caleb any reason to doubt his character. He thought about the particular kind of loyalty that grew between people who had both been underestimated by the same world. It's more than all right, he said. She uncrossed her arms. Jessup. Has to be. He picked the lock. There's no damage to the door. She was already moving through the cabin with careful steps, checking each disturbed surface. He was looking for papers. He knew exactly what he was looking for, and he knew roughly where someone might hide them. He's been watching the cabin. For days, probably. She stopped near the window. I should have moved faster. You moved fast enough, Caleb said. She turned to look at him. In the lantern light, her face was tired and sharp, and more determined than he had ever seen it, which was saying something because he had seen her be very determined. This changes things, she said. Whitmore isn't going to wait. He got Jessup to search the cabin because he's running out of patience. That means he's going to escalate. To what? To Marsh. She said it with the certainty of someone who has already thought 3 steps ahead. He's going to go to Marsh and push on those notes, not as leverage anymore as action. He wants me off this property, Caleb. Off this property and without resources and isolated enough that I can't fight him. Caleb stood very still. He's not getting that, he said. I know. She looked at him directly. But we need to move faster than 6 weeks. He was already thinking the same thing. I'll ride to the telegraph office at first light. Send a wire to Graves directly. Ask him to move the meeting earlier. Can he? I don't know, Caleb said honestly. But I'm going to ask. She nodded. Her hands had stilled now, the inventory complete, and she stood in the middle of her searched cabin with the careful composure of a woman who had made peace with the fact that nothing in her life had been simple for a long time and wasn't going to become simple now. Are you all right? He said. She looked at him for a moment. I'm angry, she said. Good. Is it? Angry is useful, he said. Angry means you haven't given up. Something moved across her face, a recognition like she'd heard something she understood all the way down. You speak from experience, she said. 11 years of it, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Go get some sleep, she said. You've got a long ride tomorrow. Pete will sit outside tonight. Caleb. Pete will sit outside tonight, he said again, with the particular quiet finality that she had learned over these weeks, meant the matter was settled, and not because he was imposing his will, but because he was stating what was going to happen, and he was right that it should happen, and they both knew it. She looked at him for a moment. Fine, she said. He nodded and left her to it, but he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of his own cabin and thought about Whitmore and Marsh and Jessup and the specific way men like that operated, not through strength, but through accumulated pressure, wearing a person down. The way water wore down. Stone, making the cost of resistance just slightly higher every day until resistance stopped seeming worth it. He'd watched it happen to other people. He was not going to watch it happen to Elizabeth. The telegraph office in Harlan Creek opened at 7 in the morning, and Caleb was standing at its door at 6:55 with a message already composed in his head. He sent 2 wires, one to Arthur Graves and Helena Short, and direct. Situation accelerated. Need earliest possible meeting. Can travel to Helena if needed. Thornton. One to a lawyer in Billings named Samuel Cross, who was not as well connected as Graves, but was local and fast, and had handled 3 of Caleb's property disputes over the years without losing once. He was riding back to the ranch when Denny caught him at the east gate, and from the look on Denny's face, the morning was about to get worse. Marsh came out himself, Denny said. Rode out an hour ago. He's in the yard talking to Miss Harper. Caleb turned Judge around without a word. Gerald Marsh was standing in the yard with his banker's coat and his careful expression, and the particular posture of a man who considers himself to be offering a courtesy by delivering bad news in person. Elizabeth was facing him from the porch steps, and she had her arms at her sides and her chin level, and the look of someone who has been waiting for this particular conversation and is not going to enjoy it, but is not afraid of it either. Caleb came into the yard at a controlled pace, not rushing, not performing urgency. He dismounted and handed Judge's reins to Denny and walked across the yard with his hands loose at his sides. Gerald, he said. Marsh turned. Caleb, I came to discuss a business matter. Then let's discuss it. Caleb stopped beside Elizabeth, not in front of her, beside her, a foot of space between them. What's the matter? Marsh looked between them once, cleared his throat. The bank has been reviewing its loan portfolio, and we have some concerns about the current terms of the notes on your eastern pastures. Given the current market, the notes are current, Caleb said. Yes. Yes, they are. But there's a provision in the original agreement that allows the bank to review terms when the risk profile of the secured property changes materially. Marsh's voice was careful, practiced. He'd prepared this speech. We've had some concerns raised about activities on this property that may affect its value and the bank's security interest. What activities? Elizabeth said. Marsh looked at her. Ma'am, this is really a matter between the bank and Mr. Thornton. I manage the financial records of this ranch, she said. If there's a concern about the bank's security interest in this property, I have a professional interest in understanding the nature of that concern. Marsh blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected her to stand quietly and look worried. The concern, Marsh said after a moment, choosing his words with visible care, is that this property has become involved in a legal dispute originating in Colorado that could create liens or encumbrances affecting the bank's collateral position. There is no legal dispute originating in Colorado, Elizabeth said calmly. There are inquiries being made by a private attorney whose client has no valid legal claim against this property or against me. Those inquiries have no standing and would be dismissed immediately by any competent court. She paused. If Mr. Whitmore has represented to you that there is an active legal dispute, he has misrepresented the situation. Marsh stared at her. Caleb watched Marsh stare at her and felt something that was not quite pride, something more complicated than pride, something that recognized what she was doing and the precision with which she was doing it. I would be happy, Elizabeth continued, to provide the bank with documentation establishing the lack of legal standing for any Colorado-based claim on this property. I would also note that a premature or unsupported invocation of the material change provision in Mr. Thornton's loan agreement would likely interest federal banking regulators who have been increasingly attentive to the use of such provisions as pressure instruments rather than legitimate risk management tools. The silence in the yard was total. Denny had stopped moving somewhere behind Caleb. Even Judge had gone still. Marsh opened his mouth, closed it. I'll take that documentation, he said finally. I'll have it to you by end of week, Elizabeth said. Marsh looked at Caleb. Caleb held his gaze without expression. Marsh looked back at Elizabeth, and something in his face had shifted, not respect exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has arrived expecting a certain kind of problem and found a substantially different one. Good day, Miss Harper, Marsh said. Good day, Mr. Marsh. He left. The yard was quiet for a moment. Then Denny said from somewhere behind them, Holy. Denny, Caleb said. Yes, sir, Denny said, and was silent. Caleb turned to look at Elizabeth. She was looking after Marsh's retreating figure with an expression that was somewhere between exhausted and satisfied. When she turned to meet his eyes, the satisfaction won out slightly. Federal banking regulators, he said. It's true, she said. There was a case in Wyoming 2 years ago. I read about it. You read about federal banking regulation cases. James was a school teacher, she said. We couldn't afford much entertainment. I read everything I could find. A pause. I didn't know it would be useful. He looked at her for a long moment. Elizabeth, he said. I need you to know something. She waited. When I asked you to come work on this ranch, he said, I thought I was doing you a kindness. She raised an eyebrow slightly. I was wrong, he said. You have done more for this ranch and for me in 6 weeks than... He stopped, started again. I want to renegotiate your contract. She blinked. My contract. Your wage isn't right, he said. It was set based on what I thought you'd be doing, which was cooking and record keeping. You're doing considerably more than that. She stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed an actual laugh, short and surprised and real, the kind of laugh that came out before a person decided whether to allow it. He'd heard it twice before, and he'd been cataloging it without admitting he was cataloging it. You want to renegotiate my contract? She said. Right now. After Gerald Marsh just threatened your banknotes. The two things aren't connected, he said. Caleb. They're not, he insisted. The wage has been bothering me for 2 weeks. She shook her head slowly, and she was still smiling, really smiling, the one that reached her eyes, the one he'd seen maybe 4 times, and that he would have been embarrassed to admit he counted. Fine, she said. We can renegotiate. Good. She looked at him a moment longer. Thank you, she said, for being beside me, not in front of me. He held her gaze. I'm learning the difference. The reply from Arthur Graves came 48 hours later, which was fast enough that Caleb felt the first real loosening of the knot that had been sitting in his chest since Pete had knocked on his door in the dark. Graves could come to them. Not Helena Graves would ride south himself with Judge Harris's written authorization to take preliminary testimony and examine documentation relevant to a potential federal fraud case. He could be in Harlan Creek within 10 days. He needed Elizabeth's documents and her sworn testimony. He needed Caleb's account of Whitmore's visit and Jessup's search of the cabin. And he needed them to hold on for 10 days without Whitmore getting what he was after. Elizabeth read the letter 3 times. 10 days, she said. 10 days, Caleb confirmed. She set the letter down and looked at her hands on the table. He'll try again before then. Yes. Jessup will try to get into the cabin again, or he'll try to follow me somewhere, or Whitmore will manufacture some legal instrument that gives him the right to demand the documents. She thought through it out loud, the way she did, quick and methodical. We need to make sure the documents are somewhere Jessup can't reach, and somewhere that a legal instrument couldn't be served. Marcus took them to the Hennessy place last night, Caleb said. She looked up fast. You talked to Marcus. He came to me, Caleb said. He said he'd been thinking about it and the cabin was too obvious now. Tom Hennessy agreed to keep them. He paused. Tom has 5 children and no patience for men who cheat widows. Her throat moved. She looked back down at the letter. Tom doesn't know what he's agreeing to. Tom knows everything, Caleb said. I told him last night. She stopped. When did you... After Pete came off his watch at midnight and reported that Jessup had ridden past the property line twice. He held her gaze. I moved fast. She was quiet for a moment. He expected her to say something about managing things without her. She'd been clear about that, and he'd been trying to honor it. But she didn't. You told me everything you did and why, she said slowly. Yes. You didn't just do it. No. He paused. I wanted to. The habit is it's an old habit, but I remembered what you said. She looked at him steadily. You actually listened. I actually listened. Another moment of quiet. I'm not sure I've met many men who do that, she said. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be either self-congratulatory or dishonest, and he was neither. He just held her gaze and let the statement sit. 10 days, she said again with a different quality this time. Less dread. More steel. 10 days, he said. On the 5th day, Harlan Creek turned. Not all of it. Not cleanly. Small towns didn't turn cleanly. They shifted gradually the way a tide shifted, pulling one way and then another, driven by forces that weren't always visible until you felt the change underfoot. What happened was this: Tom Hennessy went to the Mercantile on a Wednesday afternoon, and when Martha Pryor started in on the subject of Elizabeth Harper and the impropriety of her situation, Tom Hennessy, quiet Tom with his bad arm and his 5 children, said, "That woman has brought more dignity to this town than anyone who's been talking about her, and I'd appreciate it if you left the subject alone." Martha Pryor was so surprised she dropped a jar of preserves. By Thursday, the story had moved through town the way stories moved through small towns, faster than a horse, slower than a telegraph, and transformed somewhat in the journey. By the time it reached the livery stable, Tom had apparently said considerably more than he had, and by the time it reached the saloon, there was a version circulating that involved him pointing a finger at Martha Pryor and telling her to mind her own life. None of it was accurate. All of it was effective. On Friday, 3 of the ranchers' wives who had been carefully avoiding Elizabeth in the Mercantile made a point of saying good morning to her. One of them, Clara Delaney, whose husband's fence had crossed onto Caleb's land and whom Caleb had never once cited for it, stopped and asked after her health, with the particular warmth of a woman who was making a deliberate statement. Elizabeth told Caleb about it that evening, and he could see she didn't quite know what to do with it. "People change their minds," he said. "About women like me," she said. "People don't usually change their minds. Tom Hennessy does." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did he do that?" "Because he's a good man, and he's been watching what you are and what Whitmore is," Caleb said. "And because good men get tired of staying quiet." He paused. "He told me he wanted to." She looked at him. "Did you ask him?" "No." "Are you sure?" He almost smiled. "I'm sure." She folded her hands on the table, Something was moving in her face, emotion that she was managing with her usual control, just slightly less successfully than usual. Her eyes were brighter than they should have been for a conversation about town gossip. "Nobody has done that for me before," she said. "Stood up for me in public, without my asking, without something in it for them." "Tom has 5 kids to feed," Caleb said quietly. "And for 3 years, somebody has been making sure they had flour and salt when the money ran short. He didn't tell me that was why. He didn't need to." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "You've been holding this town together quietly for years," she said. "And none of them knew it was you. Some of them knew, and now one of them stood up for me because of it." She held his gaze. "Do you understand what you've built here, Caleb? Not just the ranch. The web of it. The way people in this valley depend on each other because of the way you've moved through it." He shifted slightly under that. It was too much being seen that precisely. He wasn't sure he had the composure for it. "I just did what was right," he said. "I know," she said softly. "That's what I'm talking about." The silence between them was different again. Every silence between them had its own quality, now its own specific weight, and this one was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with dread. It was the heavy of something that had grown too large for the space it was being kept in. She broke it first, but not in the direction he expected. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He blinked. She was looking at him directly, the way she looked at everything without apology, without the careful angling away that most people used when they were approaching something real. She just looked right at it. "I'm serious," she said. "We've been talking around a great many things, and I'm tired of talking around them." She paused. "Tell me something true that you've kept to yourself." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I talk to Rose sometimes, at the place where the barn was." He didn't look away from her. "Not out loud, but when I'm there, there's something I tell her, have been telling her for years." Elizabeth waited. "I tell her I'm sorry I let the land take everything," he said. "I tell her that I built all of this after the fire, and I don't know if it was for her memory or because I didn't know what else to do with myself." He paused. "I tell her I'm afraid it was the second thing." The kitchen was very quiet. "And lately," he said, "I've been telling her something different." He stopped. "You don't have to," Elizabeth started. "I've been telling her that I think I might want to stay," he said. She went still. "Not for the ranch," he said. "Not for—" He stopped again, and then he did something he almost never did, which was, keep talking when stopping would have been safer. "I've been telling her there's a woman who looks at me like I'm not the mountain wolf. Like I'm just a man who got lonely and kept working and ended up with more land than he knew what to do with and not enough people in it." He held Elizabeth's gaze. "I've been telling her that woman makes this place feel like something it hasn't felt like since before the fire." The word home hung in the air between them, unspoken, filling the space where it would have been. Elizabeth Harper, who had walked into a town that didn't want her with her chin up and her eyes clear, and 2 years of exhaustion behind them, sat across from him and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not grasping, not dramatic, the same way she'd touched his arm on the porch steps, steady and warm and direct the way she was, everything. "I hear you," she said. 3 words. Simple. But the way she said them meant she had heard all of it, the fire, and Rose and 11 years of silence, and the careful, costly act of saying anything at all. He turned his hand over beneath hers. She let him. On the 7th day, Jessup made his second move. He didn't go for the cabin this time. He went for Elizabeth directly. She was walking back from the Hennessy place in the late afternoon she'd taken to visiting Clara Delaney, who lived nearby in a friendship that had grown naturally out of Clara's Wednesday morning greeting when Jessup's horse came up behind her on the road. He didn't touch her. He wasn't stupid enough to touch her. He pulled his horse alongside her and kept pace and talked. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "We haven't been formally introduced. My name is Cord Jessup." She kept walking. I know who you are. Then you know I work for people who get what they want. I know you work for a man who forged a dead man's signature, she said evenly. I'd choose my employers more carefully if I were you. Jessup was quiet for a moment. You've got some nerve for a woman who's got nothing left to lose. That's where you're wrong, she said, still walking, not looking at him. I have a great deal left to lose. The difference between you and me is that I know what I'm fighting for, and you're just collecting a wage. You could make this easier on yourself, Jessup said. Give up the documents. Get yourself a fresh start somewhere. Whitmore doesn't have connections. You're young. You've got options. She stopped. She turned and looked up at him on his horse. The afternoon light was behind her, and she didn't squint. Just looked at him with that clear, direct regard that didn't know how to pretend things were other than what they were. Get off this road, she said. I'll be at the Thornton Ranch in 10 minutes, and if you're behind me when I get there, you'll find yourself explaining your employer's business to a federal land commissioner. She paused. He arrives in 3 days. She watched the information hit. She watched Jessup recalculate. She turned back around and walked. She didn't look back. She told Caleb as soon as she got to the yard. All of it exactly as it had happened. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was how he listened to everything, and then he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the implications with that slow, methodical mind of his. 3 days, he said. I told him 3 to buy a day. Graves arrives in 4. Caleb looked at her steadily. You lied to Jessup. I abbreviated the timeline, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. Elizabeth. He needed to think Whitmore was out of time, she said. If Jessup reports back that we're expecting federal presence in 3 days, Whitmore has to decide whether to escalate further and risk federal attention or pull back and reassess. She met his eyes. Men like Whitmore don't risk federal attention, not when they can regroup. And if he calls the bluff, then we handle it, she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. You walked away from Jessup on a mountain road, he said. Yes. Without flinching. I've been walking away from men who wanted to frighten me for 2 years, she said. I've gotten fairly good at it. He shook his head once slowly, and the expression on his face was something she was learning to recognize, the expression of a man who kept being surprised in the same direction over and over, and was no longer entirely sure what to do with that. Come inside, he said. Denny is making something that he calls stew, and I am withholding judgment until I taste it. She laughed. It came out easy and real, and she felt the weight of the last 7 days lift just slightly in the sound of it. He heard it, she could see that he heard it, and that he filed it away somewhere, the way he filed everything about her carefully, in the specific way of a man who was beginning to treat the details of a person like something worth keeping. She followed him inside. 4 days. She could hold on for 4 days. What she couldn't quite hold on to was the pretense that after those 4 days after Graves and his testimony, and the letters that would undo 11 years of Richard Whitmore's careful fraud, after all of that was settled and done, she could pretend she was going to walk away from this ranch and this man and this place that had given her back herself. She wasn't sure when that had become true. She suspected it had been true for longer than she was ready to admit. Graves arrived on a Thursday. He came alone, which Caleb hadn't expected, and he came on a good horse, which he had. Arthur Graves was 61 years old, and had the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent his career moving between courtrooms and wilderness and had made peace with both. He had sharp eyes and a quiet manner, and he shook Elizabeth's hand when they were introduced, the way he shook Caleb's hand direct, without the slight modification that most men applied when they were shaking a woman's hand. The half-second softening that communicated something about what they thought her hand could take. Elizabeth noticed. Caleb noticed her notice. They sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, and Graves listened for 2 hours, without interrupting except to ask precise, narrow questions that told Caleb he had already done considerable preparation before riding south. He had the letters spread in front of him, the originals that Elizabeth had kept in Kansas City, which her mother's cousin had sent by express the week prior, arriving 2 days before Graves himself. He handled them carefully, reading each one twice, cross-referencing dates against the timeline Elizabeth had laid out. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a full minute. "The codicil was filed in October of 1884, he said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "James Harper wrote this letter." He touched one of the pages carefully, in September of 1884, 5 weeks before the codicil was supposedly signed. In this letter, he explicitly tells his brother that the estate goes to you, and that this is his final decision. Yes, and in November of 1884, 3 weeks after James Harper died, Richard Whitmore filed the codicil in probate court and presented it as the controlling document. Yes. Graves looked at her. "You've been carrying this for 2 years. "Yes," she said, and her voice was even, but her hands on the table were very still, in the way they got when she was working to keep them that way. Graves looked at Caleb. "You understand what we're working with here?" "I understand it's not just an estate dispute," Caleb said. "What it is," Graves said carefully, "is evidence of fraud upon a probate court. Potentially forgery. Perjury. And because Whitmore practiced across 2 territorial jurisdictions, while doing it, there's a federal dimension that Judge Harris has been wanting a clear case to address for 3 years. He paused. "This is that case." The kitchen was very quiet. Elizabeth said, "What does that mean, practically?" "Practically it means I ride back to Helena tomorrow with these letters and a sworn statement from you and one from Caleb documenting Whitmore's conduct here, and I put them in front of Harris." Graves met her eyes steadily. "It means Whitmore is going to have a very bad autumn. It means the Harper estate proceedings will be reviewed and very likely overturned. And it means that if James Harper's brother had knowledge of the forged codicil, if he participated in it, he will be facing his own set of problems." Elizabeth took a slow breath. "And my land. If the codicil is invalidated, the estate reverts to the original will." Graves was careful. "I cannot promise outcomes. I can tell you what the evidence supports, and that Harris is a man who follows evidence." He paused. "But I would not have ridden 4 days south if I didn't believe in this case." She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked up. "What do we do right now? Tonight?" "Tonight," Graves said, "I need your written statement. Everything from James's death through Whitmore's arrival in Harlan Creek. Everything Jessup said to you on the road. Everything Marsh said in this yard." He reached into his coat and produced a leather folio. "I'll take it tonight and sign it before I leave tomorrow. Caleb, I'll need the same from you." "You'll have it," Caleb said. "And Miss Harper." Graves set the folio on the table between them. "Whitmore is going to know what's happening within days of my return to Helena. He has connections, and he will use them. For a period of time, possibly weeks, possibly longer, you may face additional pressure." "I know," she said. "You're prepared for that." She looked at Graves steadily. "Mr. Graves, I've been prepared for that since I left Colorado. I'd rather face it with something fighting back than spend another 2 years running." Graves studied her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb with the expression of a man making an assessment he hadn't necessarily come intending to make. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." They wrote until midnight. Caleb's statement came easier than he expected. He had the kind of memory that retained specific dates and exact words, and the precise sequence of events, and Graves guided him through it, with questions that pulled out details Caleb hadn't thought were significant, but that Graves received with a particular stillness that meant they were. Elizabeth's statement took longer. Not because she was uncertain, she was precise and clear and exhaustive in a way that told Caleb she had been rehearsing this testimony in her head for 2 years, had been building the case in her own mind long before there was anyone to bring it to. It took longer because there was more of it. 2 years of being told she had no legal standing. 2 years of a fraudulent document standing between her and what her husband had meant to leave her. She laid it out with the careful, controlled voice of a woman who understood that emotion was a weapon that cut the person holding it when used incorrectly, and who was saving hers for something more useful. When they were done, and Graves had reviewed both statements and signed them as a federal officer receiving sworn testimony, he stood up and stretched and looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. "I'll write at first light," he said. "There's a spare room," Caleb said. Graves nodded once. He looked at Elizabeth. "You did the right thing keeping those letters." "I didn't know they were evidence at the time," she said. "I just wanted something of James's." "The law is full of moments where someone did something simple and human," Graves said, "and it turned out to be the thing that mattered. Don't discount it." He paused at the kitchen doorway. "Good night, Miss Harper. Caleb?" He went to the spare room. Caleb and Elizabeth sat at the table with the remains of 3 cold coffee cups and 2 years of her history laid out between them in pages of careful handwriting, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "It's real." "Yes," he said. I kept thinking something would stop it, that Whitmore would find a way, that Marsh would—" She stopped. "I've been waiting for the floor to drop out since the day I got here." "The floor held," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and she wasn't crying. Elizabeth Harper did not cry easily or publicly. He'd learned that about her, the way he'd learned everything about her by watching, but she was close to something, some edge of feeling that she'd been holding back for a very long time. "Because of you?" she said. He shook his head. "Caleb, you had the letters," he said. "You kept the letters for 2 years when keeping them was dangerous. You walked into this town and asked for work when everyone told you to leave. You faced Marsh in this yard and used language he didn't have an answer for." He held her gaze. "I gave you a place to stand. You did everything else." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was shifting in her face, something that had been held carefully in place for weeks moving toward the surface. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When Graves asked me if I was prepared for more pressure from Whitmore," she said slowly, "I said yes, and I am." She paused. "But what I didn't say was that when he asked it, the first thing I thought about wasn't the letters or the case, or even James." She looked at her hands. "The first thing I thought about was whether whatever comes next would mean leaving here." The kitchen was very quiet, and I realized, she said, still looking at her hands, that the answer I wanted was no. He said nothing. "I have been very careful," she said, not to make this into something it isn't. You gave me employment and protection, and you've been—" She stopped. "You have been the most decent man I have ever known, and I have been very aware that decent men deserve not to be taken advantage of by women who have nowhere else to go. Elizabeth." His voice came out lower than he intended. She looked up. "You are not taking advantage of anything," he said. "You have not taken advantage of a single thing since the day you got here. You have worked for every dollar of your wage, and you have held your own in every situation, and you have—" He stopped. He made a decision. He made it the way he made most decisions, slowly, with full understanding of the weight of it. "You have made me feel like staying," he said. "Like this ranch is worth coming home to at the end of a day. Like there is something in this cabin that is worth walking toward." Her breathing had changed. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I haven't done it in 11 years, and I wasn't sure I'd ever want to again. I'm not—" He looked at his hands. "I'm a large, quiet man who talks to his dead wife at the place where a barn used to be. I'm not—" "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Stop telling me what you're not," she said quietly. "I know what you are. I've known for weeks." He held her gaze. "Then you know I'm asking," he said. She held his gaze right back. "I know," she said. And, she said, "I'm not going anywhere." The news from Helena came in 3 waves. The way significant news always came, the first wave being the most fragmentary and the most urgent, the second filling in what the first had left out, and the third arriving after everyone had already adjusted to the new reality, and serving mostly as confirmation. The first wave came 2 weeks after Graves rode north. A telegraph from Helena addressed to Caleb, short and direct in Graves's style. Harris reviewed materials. Whitmore issued summons. Federal fraud inquiry open. Hold position. Caleb read it twice in the telegraph office, then rode back to the ranch at a pace that alarmed Denny. Elizabeth read it standing in the yard, and he watched the 2 years fall off her shoulders in the space of about 4 seconds. She didn't cry. He'd stopped expecting her to. What she did was look up at him with those clear, direct eyes and say, "It's working." "Yes," he said. "He'll fight it." "Yes." "It could take months." "Yes." She looked back at the paper. "I don't care," she said. "I don't care how long it takes. He's not going to make it disappear now." She looked up again. "He can't make it disappear now?" "No," Caleb said. "He can't." The second wave came 10 days later, a longer letter from Graves detailing the scope of the federal inquiry, which had expanded to include 2 additional cases in Colorado, where Whitmore had been involved in estate proceedings with similar irregularities. The Harper case had opened a door that Harris had been looking for an excuse to open, and he was walking through it with characteristic deliberateness. Whitmore had retained counsel. He had issued statements through his lawyers claiming the letters were forgeries, a claim that, as Graves noted with dry precision, required him to simultaneously argue that his client had not forged the codicil, and that Elizabeth had forged James's letters, which was a logical position requiring a great deal of audacity and very little self-awareness. Jessup had left Harlan Creek the day after Graves rode north. Nobody saw him go. Gerald Marsh had sent Caleb a formal letter through the bank expressing confidence in the continued strength of their lending relationship and making no further mention of the material change provision. Caleb filed the letter without response. Martha Pryor had, according to Clara Delaney, been conspicuously quiet on the subject of Elizabeth Harper for the past 3 weeks. The third wave came on a Monday morning, and it came not as a telegraph or a letter, but in the person of Tom Hennessy, who rode to the ranch with his bad arm and his worried eyes. Except that this time the worry was gone, and something else had replaced it. He came into the yard, and he looked at Elizabeth, who was standing near the fence, talking to Denny about the horses, and he said, "My wife's cousin is a clerk in the Helena Territorial Court. She sent word this morning." Elizabeth turned. "Whitmore's counsel withdrew yesterday," Tom said. "Both of them. His lead lawyer and his second both withdrew in the same day, which in the legal world means they looked at what Harris had, and they decided they didn't want to be standing next to Whitmore when the verdict came in." The yard was very quiet. "It's over," Elizabeth said. "It's not over, Tom said carefully. "There's still proceedings, but a lawyer doesn't leave a paying client in the middle of a federal inquiry unless they think that client is going to lose badly and publicly. They withdrew because they could see where it was going." He paused. "My cousin says the word in Helena is that Harris is about to issue findings. And when Harris issues findings, they stick." Elizabeth put her hand on the fence post beside her. Just rested it there, like she needed something solid. Caleb watched her. She stood that way for a long moment. Then she straightened, and the hand came off the post, and she looked at Tom with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and only mostly succeeding. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "For everything. For Martha Pryor and for the letters and for—" "You don't need to thank me," Tom said. "I do actually," she said. Tom looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb, and the look was the look of a man communicating something without words in the specific way that men who have worked alongside each other communicate, direct and economical and perfectly understood. Caleb nodded once. Tom touched the brim of his hat and rode home. 10. It was Denny who said the thing that needed saying because Denny was 19 and hadn't yet learned the art of keeping things to himself, and on this particular afternoon, Caleb was grateful for that. They were in the barn, the 3 of them, Caleb and Denny and Marcus, and the conversation had been about Juniper, who was fully recovered and moving through the barn with the easy confidence of a horse that had been properly cared for and knew it. But then it wasn't about Juniper anymore. Because Denny had the look again. "Say it," Caleb said. "She's going to leave," Denny said. Marcus, to his credit, said nothing. He just kept his hands on the tack he was working and kept his eyes down, which was his way of making it clear that he was listening, while also making it clear he wasn't going to jump in either way. "She has property to go back to," Denny said. "In Colorado. When Harris rules and the estate is restored, she'll have her husband's land. She'll have somewhere to go." He wasn't being cruel about it. He was being young, which sometimes produced the same directness. She came here with nothing. She won't have nothing anymore. And she's the kind of woman who will want her own place. Caleb stood beside Juniper and said nothing. "I just think," Denny said, with the slightly more careful tone of a young man realizing he may have walked into something. "I just think that if you don't say something, she might think you're ready for things to go back to how they were, before she came." "And you think I'm not," Caleb said. Denny met his eyes. "I think you're not." Marcus looked up from the tack. Just briefly, just long enough. Caleb looked at his hands. The same hands he'd looked at 100 times in this barn. The scarred, calloused hands of a man who had built everything he owned by himself and had been carrying everything by himself for 11 years. "She said she wasn't going anywhere," Caleb said. Denny blinked. "She said that, yes. When? That's between her and me," Caleb said. Denny looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Denny. Something passed between them that Caleb didn't need to see to understand. "Oh," Denny said with a great deal of feeling packed into one syllable. "Get back to work," Caleb said. "Shannon." He found her at the north cabin that evening, sitting on the porch, the way she sometimes did at the end of the day, not reading, not working, just sitting with a cup of cooling coffee and the last of the summer light and her own thoughts. She looked up when she heard him coming, and something in her face settled in the particular way it settled when it was him and not someone else. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Denny thinks you're going to leave," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "And what do you think?" "I think you told me you weren't going anywhere." He held her gaze. "I'm asking if that's still true." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because you're going to have your land back," he said. "Your husband's property, your own place. You came here with nothing, and you'll have something, and a woman who has her own something doesn't need to stay on someone else's ranch." "You're right," she said. "She doesn't need to." The word need sat between them. "Elizabeth," he said. "Caleb," she said back with a warmth in it, a gentle and deliberate warmth that was a specific kind of answer. He came up the porch steps. He stopped a foot from her chair, and he looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them looked away. "I have not done this well before," he said. "You've been doing fine," she said. "I'm serious." "So am I." She set the coffee cup down on the porch rail. "You think you don't know how to do this. You've spent 11 years telling yourself that. But Caleb..." She stood up, so she was close, so she was looking at him at the near distance that required a person to be certain of their ground. "You listened when I asked you to. You stood beside me instead of in front of me. You told me about Rose." She paused. "Do you know how many men would have done none of those things and thought they were doing everything right?" He was quiet. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go. Because I don't want to go." She looked at him with those eyes that had looked at him straight from the very first day. "The question is, what we do about that." He reached up and took her hand. The one closest to him. The one that had rested on his arm that night in the rain. The one that had covered his on the kitchen table. He held it with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a big man, who had learned that strength meant you chose how to use it. "Stay," he said. One word. She looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to hold everything that had happened since a broken wagon stopped by his gate in the summer heat. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her. "Elizabeth Harper," he said, and his voice was low and certain, and entirely without apology. "I am asking you to stay on this ranch. Not as an employee, not as a guest, as the woman who belongs here. As my wife, if you'll have me." He held her gaze. "I know I'm a large, quiet man with too much land and a history that hasn't been easy, and a habit of talking to people who can't answer. I know this isn't a simple life, and I know you've had enough complicated." He paused. "But I also know that you make this place feel like something it hasn't felt like in 11 years, and I know that I would spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of the way you look at me." The summer evening was completely quiet around them. Elizabeth Harper looked at the man who had seen her standing alone in a street and asked if she needed help, and then stood beside her steadily and without apology through everything that came after. She thought about James, who had been kind and gentle and had not deserved what happened to him. She thought about 2 years of walking through a world that kept telling her she was on her own. She thought about a barn at midnight and a bear lumbering back into the dark, and a voice saying, "Can you smell it?" and both of them standing their ground without either of them suggesting the other one leave. She thought about what it meant to fight beside someone instead of alone. "Yes," she said. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just yes, clear and direct, and certain the way she said everything. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for considerably longer than this conversation. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He brought her hand up and pressed it once briefly against his chest, just above the heart, in the gesture of a man who didn't have words for the size of what he was feeling, and had found the most direct way he knew to show it. She put her other hand there too. They stood on the porch of the north cabin in the last of the summer light, and it was not a fairy tale, and it was not the end of anything that needed to be resolved. Whitmore's proceedings would run their course. The Colorado land would take time. There were accounts to reconcile and horses to care for, and a fence on the north pasture that still needed 3 new posts. The ranch didn't stop being the ranch. Life didn't stop being life. But it stopped being empty. Arthur Graves's final letter arrived 6 weeks later, in the first cool days of autumn, when the mountains had begun to turn, and the morning air carried the first memory of the coming cold. Harris had issued his findings. The codicil was fraudulent. The evidence of James Harper's letters was held to be conclusive. Richard Whitmore was facing federal charges of fraud and perjury, with a third charge being considered based on evidence that had emerged from the 2 additional cases his inquiry had uncovered. His license to practice law in any federal territory was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. James Harper's brother had entered into cooperation with federal investigators. The Harper estate, as originally constituted under the will, was restored. Elizabeth read the letter at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her, and her coffee cooling the same as it always did. And when she finished, she set it down and looked at the table for a long moment. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up. "I have land in Colorado." "Yes?" "I have no intention of going to it." "I know. But it's mine," she said. And in those 2 words was everything that a woman carries when the world has tried to take what belongs to her and she has fought to get it back. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and more lasting than triumph. The particular satisfaction of a thing restored. "It's yours," he said. She looked at him. "What would you think about leasing it to a family who needs land?" He studied her. "Like the Hennessy's. Like whoever needs it most," she said. "We don't need it, but someone will." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about flour and salt delivered before dawn to a family with 5 children and a father with a bad arm. He thought about the particular way that people who had been without something understood the weight of giving it. "We can look into it," he said. The word we landed between them like it had been landing for weeks now, easy and certain, and without fanfare, the most natural word in the room. She smiled. The full one. The one he'd counted 4 times before, and had since stopped counting because it was no longer rare enough to catalog. "We should tell the boys," she said. "They already know," Caleb said. "You told them." "Told." Denny figured it out. Marcus has known for weeks. Pete cried, which he will deny. He paused. Tom Hennessy brought a pie. Clara made it. He was very clear about that, but he brought it. She laughed. The easy, real laugh that still hit him somewhere under his ribs, the way it had the first time he'd heard it. When did all of this happen? She said. While you were writing your response to Graves, he said. I was writing for 2 hours. Small town? He said. News moves fast. She shook her head, but the smile stayed. We should still tell them, properly. We should? He agreed. They did. That evening at the long table in the ranch house kitchen that had been silent for too many years, 5 people sat down to a meal that Clara Delaney had actually made and Tom had actually brought. And Caleb Thornton looked around the table at the people who had built something with him in the summer heat of Montana, and felt for the first time since a fire had taken everything he thought mattered that the thing he had been building toward was finally clear. It wasn't the land. It had never been the land. It was this. The table, the voices, the specific weight of a life shared with people who chose to stay. Elizabeth caught his eye from across the table. She knew what he was thinking. She usually did. She raised her coffee cup slightly. Not a toast, not a performance, just a small private acknowledgement between 2 people who had both been alone long enough to understand exactly what they'd found. He raised his in return. Denny talked too much. Pete denied crying about the engagement for the 3rd time in an hour. Marcus laughed once, low and genuine, and it was rare enough that everyone at the table turned to look at him, and he shook his head and went back to his food. Tom Hennessy told a story about Clara and the pie that got longer and more elaborate with each telling. Outside the Montana mountains held the last of the summer light before letting it go to autumn. Inside the Thornton Ranch was exactly what it had always had the capacity to be, and what it had taken one woman with a battered carpet bag and a straight spine and 2 years of hard-won clarity to finally bring out of it. Not a lonely man's fortress. A home. And Caleb Thornton, who had spent 11 years believing he would live and die alone in the shadow of these mountains, sat at his own table, surrounded by the sound of people who had chosen to stay. And he understood at last what the land had been waiting for all along. It had been waiting for her. It had been waiting for this. And it was worth every single year of the